Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to be here, and I want to get this out of the way. I apologize to you all for not getting here on time. Not only was I not going to be, I was not only going to be here on time, I was going to be the first one here. That was my goal, and I want to say for the record that my mistake was not because of dementia, and I don't because I have friends who have dementia, and that is an excuse why people sometimes have a mistake like that. Mine was just stupidity, ignorance, whatever. So my apologies, and I want to get that out of the way because I know you'll forgive me. I have a tough time forgiving myself. I hate to be late. So I'm hope maybe halfway through the first presentation, I'll finally forgive myself over it. Hope you got to eat something special or got to talk a little longer. I told Neil, I said, I'll talk 10 minutes less if that'll make you all feel better. That would be my penance. But he said, no, that's okay. Anyway, I bring greetings from Big Sandy. I'll see some of you at the feast down in Destin, but others of you won't make it. I'm glad to see you this time. I'm not traveling as much because of, well, I want to stay close to my wife. She has Epstein-Barr. She's had Epstein-Barr for a long time, and she has all sorts of health issues. And I don't like to get too far away. This is about the limit how far I'd like to go since I'm driving most times. So I'm tired, putting in a lot of hours, getting to spend time with my wife, which is good, to spend time with my grandson, which is good. They're in a split family, so when my son gets him, half the time it's a good split, half and half. But I spend a lot of time with him. He's 8 years old, and I'm trying to be there for him. He can tell me absolutely anything, and I will not blush, blink, because I want to be there for him in case different things happen at school or other situations. I just want to be there for him. So I'm pretty busy. I'm not retired, don't plan to retire. Put in long hours working for the brethren and also trying to take care of my family. So I did appreciate the opportunity to come over and see y'all, and looking forward to seeing some of you at the feast. I will go with what we said as far as Neil reminded me that I normally give two presentations. So this first one will be a little shorter one, although it's the longer handout. You look at the handout, it says Find God Part 1, Find God Part 2. Well, obviously, I did cover it in two 40-minute presentations, but I can just pick the highlights and just make a couple quick points about finding God. You know, my purpose whenever I come is to speak anywhere is to point people to God and to encourage you. That's what I try to do every time. It's just a matter of what subjects I'll pick to point you to God and encourage you. This, if you see on the handout, you'll see that this when I gave this in Big Sandy, a lot of times what I do, I give something in Big Sandy, and then I take it as a traveling message about a year later, because in case some of you are listening on the internet, I don't want you to hear it too quickly. So some of the favorite things I give, I put it on the shelf, and then it's one of my traveling messages. But this was given after I talked about the 10 Commandments. I was talking about the first commandment. And in talking about the first commandment, on the handout, I just reminded people about how many gods there were in Egypt. According to some of the internet sources, there were over 1,000 gods in Egypt. And then I decided, let's see how many Greek gods there were. And while everyone knows the famous 12 Greek gods, there were many, many more as well. So there are many gods out there. And what the thing is, in the Church of God, we seek to find the one true God, to worship the one true God and his son, Jesus Christ. And then what I did in the second one, and that's the question I want to pose today in this presentation. Did you find God or did God find you? This is actually a good interactive discussion. I do this interactively sometimes. Did you find God or did God find you? As in everything, it'll come down to how you define the terms. How you define the terms will oftentimes answer that question. Let me show you real quickly why we would say God found us. Let's look at John 6:44. Let me make the case why we say God would find us. And I guess if you want to get real technical about it, that would be the right answer. But then why am I posing the question? Because I think if I pose the question in such a way, it can help your relationship with God. John 6:44, you know the scripture well, red letter. Jesus said, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." So according to what Jesus said, the Father calls people. The Father calls people to the Son and then works salvation through the Son. So we can easily see then that, God is very involved in the process. He's very involved in the process. But I guess we'd have to ask ourselves, how involved are we in the process? And what should we be doing? But I think, God's the one finding us. But when I conclude this little segment, I'm going to show you that we should still be seeking God. A couple examples in the Bible where it shows, I won't take the time to go through them. If you remember Saul in the New Testament, you remember the road to Damascus experience? Well, there's a case where he thought he had a relationship with God. He was putting people in prison in the service of God. He was killing Stephen in the service of God. And so there are a lot of people who think they're worshiping God. They really think they have a commitment with God. But it really wasn't what he thought it was. In fact, on the road to Damascus experience, God got his attention. Actually, Christ did. Christ said, "Why do you persecute me?" And he got his attention. And then, so I bring this up because even when God starts the process, your first calling, remember how you were first called? Remember the good stories about that? It's fun to talk about those good stories when you were first called. But hopefully you have aha moments through your whole life. You have aha moments where God reaches down and takes us to a next level. And of course, not only do we have the New Testament example of Saul, we have the Old Testament example of Job, where God took Job to a next level. And I love talking about the book of Job, but I've studied that a lot. I've learned a lot from different people. I've taught a lot about it. I love to talk about it, but I would take a long time. But when God started that process with Job, see, a lot of people get Job mixed up. I'll at least mention some basics. They get Job mixed up. They think, well, let me show. Let's look at it. Job chapter 1. I love talking about Job. We won't be able to talk about Job very much today, but we'll talk about a little bit in the context of, does God find us or do we find God? Job chapter 1. Some people feel that the trial of Job occurred because Job was a sinner. Wrong. Many theologians say that Job was a sinner and that's why the trial happened. That's wrong. You'll hear Church of God teachers say that the trial came because Job was a sinner. Wrong. Job 1:1 says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. That doesn't sound like a horrible sinner. That sounds like he was the best thing going. What do you mean he wasn't up to God's level? Of course, God had to take him higher, but he was going well. You remember who started the trial? God did. Verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where'd you come from? Where you been?" And Satan said, to and fro, up and down, at the mall, over at the ball game, at the park, just like people would say. And then verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, a blameless man, an upright man. He fears God and shuns evil." God started that trial. That'd be like God coming up and say, God would say, "Have you considered my friend Neil Parker? Have you considered my son David Mason?" You put all your names in there. So sometimes trials come because God is doing something positive, not correcting us. Now, we bring enough of our own correction on ourselves by our mistakes. Thankfully, we have God's forgiveness. But God was taking Job to the next level. He was teaching him a lesson. And by the way, I like to mention that while it was God's purpose, he allowed Satan to provide the details. Because Satan said, "Well, does Job fear you for nothing? You have a hedge around him." Verse 11, "Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you." And God said, "Plan approved. Details approved. We're going to do the details you said to fulfill my overall purpose." So, by the way, nothing can be outside God's will. But the fact is, God sometimes allows others to give input. Satan to give input, evil input. For his overall purpose, he's still in charge. And you know what happened in chapter 2, verse 3? He said, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still holds his integrity. Satan said, new plan, skin for skin. Stretch out your hand and touch him. Touch his bone, touch his flesh, and he'll curse you. And God said, plan approved, details approved. And Satan provided some of the details within God's will, because God's in charge. And of course, in the situation here, Job started out really well. Remember I told you that there's actually two things people get wrong about the book of Job. The book of Job, they think it happened because of Job's sins. That's not why it happened. And then they say he had a great attitude. I think I mentioned this before. I was at a church, after a church shooting up in Wisconsin about 2005, 2006, in the Living Church of God. I knew some of the people up there because I would go up to Hal Geiger's barn dance. By the way, Hal Geiger's planning to be in Destin, which I'm happy to see him again. He may even build the sukkah at the front of the thing again. We'll see if he does. But Hal's going to be there at least for half the feast. And I go up to Hal's barn dance, and he would invite all the different churches to come over to church service. And they wouldn't come. Then they'd invite them all to a barn dance, and they'd come to the barn dance. And so at the barn dance, I would sing karaoke with people. I love to sing. I'd sing karaoke with them. And some of the people that I met at the barn dance and sang karaoke with, they were shot in that church. So I went up to the funeral. In fact, when I went up to the funeral, a couple of the members were like, "Are you going to preach these funerals?" Which I would have relished the opportunity to say good words at those funerals, but they weren't going to ask me to preach at those funerals. And the guy started out with, they had about 4 different funerals, and they had a bunch of young kids there, teenagers. And I thought, this is a great chance to reach those kids. And then he said, he talked about Job's book of Job. And after Job had his trials, he didn't complain and didn't sin. And I wanted to stand up and say, no! Because basically what he told all those people is, stuff your feelings, push your feelings down, and just get over it. He didn't mean to, because he'd probably never done a funeral like that before. And I thought, book of Job, yes, he's going to. He said the wrong thing, because people need to express themselves through their feelings, express themselves through their tough times. Because, by the way, I know where they get it from. They say in Job 1, verse 21 and 22, Job 1:21 says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Verse 22, and all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That was true up to that point. And then he said in chapter 2, verse 10, he said the last line of chapter 2, verse 10, and all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So people stopped right there and said, Job just handled it. No, if the book of Job ended after Job 1 and 2, that would have been the conclusion. But the rest of the book, Job complained and blamed God. It's very plain he did that. So again, originally he had a good attitude. But the more he thought about it, he blamed God. And God worked with him, and God brought him to a level of maturity. God used the trial to help Job improve, but it was not a flawless process. In fact, so you can understand when you have situations in your life and you have bad days, those things happen. In fact, if you don't have bad days, you're fooling yourself, because they're just squashing down bad thoughts and bad feelings. You got to work through the bad days in a biblical, spiritual way. But I point this out because I just showed you 2 examples very quickly, 2 examples of how God worked with someone who he took them to a higher level, even after they were introduced to God. So when I ask the question, did you find God or does God find you? I think technically the answer is God finds us, but we should spend the rest of our life learning to have a better relationship with him. So like I said, this is the short version of this presentation. Let's go to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, and I want to read this in conclusion. Again, what I hope from this presentation will help you accept the fact that God has called you, accept the fact that God has found you, but I'm going to still encourage you to go seeking for him. Let it be a two-way relationship. But let's read Acts chapter 17, verses 23, it's actually verses 22 to 31. I'm reading out of the New King James, and when it gets to verse 27, it uses the word grope, which is the way, I don't think it's found that in the King James. And grope means reaching for, seeking. A lot of times people think of groping as it can be used in a bad connotation. But the New King James is going to use the word grope, and I think it's most appropriate. Are you seeking for God? Are you reaching for God? Are you wanting God? But Dave, you just told us that he finds us. That's right, he finds us. But I think then we should make our whole life continuing to want to find him and wanting to grow and change. So I'm going to conclude by reading Acts 17, verses 22 through 31, encouraging in this little short presentation today, to encourage you that even though God has entered into your life by his choice, I hope it's your choice that you will reach out to him. Verse 22, Paul says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temple made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. And he has determined the pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, quote, 'For we are also his offspring,' unquote. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art or man's devisings. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, and now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness, by the man whom he has ordained. And he has given assurances to all by raising him from the dead." The great God who created everything, the great God who called you, sends out a message to all of us. Let's spend our time seeking him.